brief summary of the Russian-Ukraine war. Putin is right about one thing. To really understand this conflict, you need to understand history. A real, factual history. Ukrainians and Russians are part of East Slavic tribes. The 9th to 13th century, Kievan Rus was the cultural center, Moscow was a tiny village. After the Kievan Rus collapsed, the clear separation between Russians and Ukrainians was forming that defines today's conflict between the countries. Because Russians start developing under the Mongol rule, adopting a lot of Mongol and Turk traditions into their culture and their language, while Ukrainians develop under the Polish-Lithuanian rule. But the people are influenced by the Western dominance. The Ukrainian language, unlike the Russian language, has a lot more Old East Slavic words. But in time, Russia becomes an empire. In 1654, the Ukrainian Cossacks made a deal with the Russian Empire, pledging loyalty to the Russian Tsar. That's how Ukraine integrated into the Russian Empire. The reason why the Ukrainian Cossacks made this deal with Russia is because they were revolting against the Polish-Lithuanian rule that was suppressing Ukrainian peasants. Now, the Russian Empire actively adopted the policy of Russification, which is the forceful imposition of the Russian identity, the Russian language, onto the local population, which entailed suppression of the nationalistic elites, cultural figures, etc. The goal was to make everyone Russian. And that's a very significant element to the conflict today, because it has been centuries since Russians learned not to perceive any national identities as valid. That's why they keep claiming that Ukraine is actually Russia, that Ukraine was created by Lenin, that the Ukrainian language is actually Russian language, contrary to all of the evidence pointing to the opposite. Now let's jump forward a couple of centuries. Ukraine tried to become independent from Russia through many points in history, through the cultural figures, political figures that were destroyed by Russia. It even tried to become independent after the Russian Revolution in 1917. That never happened, but the Soviet Union adopted even more ruthless policies on Russification. And that's why the Soviet Union conducted genocide against the Ukrainian people during Holodomor in 1932-33. Again, with the goal of destroying the Ukrainian national identity, destroying the Ukrainian ability to resist. So you have two independent nations, Ukrainians and Russians. And Russians were trying to claim the Ukrainian national identity through many centuries, just like they tried to do that to other national identities. And that's why independent Ukraine has always faced only one threat: Russia. That's why when Ukraine gave up on its nuclear weapons, it needed Russia to sign Budapest Memorandum, where Russia promised to respect Ukrainian independent territories. Through the Ukrainian independence since 1991, Russia tried to be present in the Ukrainian politics. The Ukrainian president of the early 2000s, Kuchma, was trying to make Ukraine like Russia. He was suppressing dissent, he was destroying journalists, but Ukrainians were not going to take it. That's why Ukrainians had Orange Revolution. Of course, naturally, Russia blamed it on the West, but it had nothing to do with America. As usual through its history, Ukraine was more aligned with the West, and that's why in 2014, Maidan Revolution happened. But the only thing Ukrainians wanted is to join EU, not NATO, EU. Peacefully protested, but the Ukrainian President Yanukovych decided to violently suppress those peaceful protesters. That's when revolution happened, and that's when Russia saw the threat, and Ukraine finally slipped into its independent future outside of Russia, and that's when Russia attacked in 2014. Later, Putin explained why he attacked Ukraine, but MAGA refused to listen. He said that he does not consider Ukrainians as independent entity, that Ukrainians must be part of Russia because it's Russia's historical past. Again, continuing the tradition of centuries of the Russian Russification and imperialism. After the war started in 2014, Ukrainians actually have conducted a lot of reforms in improving Ukraine, reducing corruption, becoming a very pro-Western developed economy. Russia was not happy with that because, again, Ukraine was slipping away, so he attacked. And as Putin explained himself, he wants Russia to return to its historical glory, aka the Russian imperialism. That's why it needed to capture Ukraine. He believes to be the core to the Russian history. This war has nothing to do with NATO. It has to do with one thing: the Russian imperialism.